But I just wanted to start off with a brief introduction because this is Jewish Renaissance's first event of 2024. I can't believe we're already in 2024 and have been for a month. The time goes so fast nowadays. But it's really lovely to have you all here. Many of our subscribers I recognise, and also lots of new faces who are interested in Philip Guston. So welcome to you, and also welcome to all the people who will be watching this later on at home by video after the fact. I'm really pleased today on both counts that we are doing a session about Philip Guston and that we have Irene Wise with us to do that session, to be the speaker and to help us explore his art, his life and his politics. I went to see the Philip Guston exhibition at the Tate, and I have to admit I'd never heard about him until about 2 or 3 years ago when there was a big controversy. When I did go and see the exhibition, actually what struck me was I was kind of upset that there had been some controversy and people unwilling to put on the show, because it felt to me, however much I liked or didn't like different of the images, it felt a very urgent and necessary questioning of how we operate as political and artistic people in the world. So I've been delighted that we've been covering the show. We had an article in our magazine about Philip Guston and about the process of putting the show together that was written by Monica Bohm-Duchan. And Irene today is going to be talking about Philip Guston's, as I mentioned, art, life, and that kind of social and political impulse which drove him. So Irene Wise, who is our speaker, is someone who's been connected to Jewish Renaissance since its inception. Irene was the very first art director of the magazine. And in fact, that was how the two of us met, because 23 years ago it is now, I was an intern on the first 3 issues, little knowing that I would come back all these years later as the director. And Irene really put the magazine together with Janet Levin from scratch. And she designed what would have a huge impact, visual impact, for our magazine, in which our current art director, Becky Redman, has very much continued to celebrate. So we're really grateful to you, Irene, for that. But also, as well as being the art director of Jewish Renaissance, you've been many other things. Irene was a senior lecturer in media and culture at Roehampton University. She's been a fellow of the Imperial War Museum, where she did Holocaust education for many years. She also taught for many years at the British Library and has developed and delivered educational programmes at a huge range of museum and galleries throughout the UK. She's also a very accomplished artist herself. Her paintings have been exhibited and she's illustrated books, and she's also been an illustrator for Channel 4, for the BBC, amongst many other things, for The Guardian, amongst many other accomplishments. So Irene, we're really delighted that you're joining us and that you're going to talk to us about Philip Guston, not just from the view of an academic, but as a fellow artist. So I'm going to hand things over to you. But I know before you start your PowerPoint, you'd like us to return to gallery view and just ask the group a few questions.
Yeah, well, hello, everybody. I just want to say thank you so much for coming. And I wondered how many of you have actually seen the exhibition. Now, some of you aren't showing me your faces, but you might want to put a hand up, an ordinary hand up. You don't have to do a digital one. If you've seen it. You've seen it. Okay, great. It's just good to know who I'm talking to, really. And I'm going to show you a PowerPoint of his work and just talk a little bit about his life and his influences. And I'm going to right now share my PowerPoint with you. So There, that should do it. And you're probably familiar with this painting, and it's got the notorious hooded figure that caused so much disruption, and which delayed the exhibition for a couple of years. So you probably know this painting, or you've already seen it, and I'll be talking about it later. I'm going to give you some facts about his life. He was born Philip Guston. He changed his name to please the parents of Mr. McKim, the woman he eventually married. He was trying to make a good impression. Interesting that he felt he couldn't really have a Jewish name when he met them. But he did actually feel a great deal of regret about changing his name later on. His parents were Lieb and Rachel, and they had come over. Well, first of all, Lieb came over with almost no money, and he came to Montreal. Like many Jewish immigrants, they were escaping vicious pogroms and just searching for a better life. Gradually, the children followed with Rachel. They sailed from England to Nova Scotia and then on to Montreal. And they settled in Canada, and more children were born. A cousin recalls a tense household. Rachel kept kosher, and she sent the children to a Jewish school. Louis objected to religious education. So you can see they're already quite different. Rachel was warm and supportive, but Louis was depressed and remote. There was just an enormous amount of pressure on him, really. They were very, very poor. He became a citizen of Canada in 1910 and called himself a blacksmith. Very, very difficult to get work. He became a boilermaker, working for the Canadian Pacific Railway. But it was a very, very meagre living, and it was hard to make ends meet. And in 1922, they moved to Los Angeles. Now, this terrible thing happened in 1923. He took his own life. And there are stories about how he was found. At the time, the father was working as a rag picker or junkman, and he hanged himself. Rachel, the mother, told the police that she found her husband's body hanging on the back porch. And she said that up till that point, he'd been in good spirits. But Philip recalled that he found the body hanging by a rope from a rafter in a back shed and had to cut it down. So we don't know which story is right, but obviously it was hugely traumatic for this child. And the Holocaust and anti-Semitism and poverty are all motifs that come up again and again in his work. The Holocaust, because of course they fled the pogroms, and anti-Semitism because it was happening in his childhood. So in 1925, he's really serious about drawing, and he actually works in a cupboard because the house or flat, I don't know what they lived in, was poor circumstances. It was so crowded that he wanted to have a bit of peace and quiet. And so he just used to sit in this cupboard, especially when the older siblings came with their families, and the extended family were there. It was noisy. So he just worked in a in a cupboard, and there was a bare light bulb in there. And all these things come up again and again in his work. So I want you to notice that, the idea of the noose and the light bulb. Now, this other tragedy happens in 1932. His brother died. It was this horrible accident. His brother's legs were crushed when his own car rolled onto him, and he died of gangrene. So that's another trauma. So what you find a lot in his paintings are also legs and shoes and boots, references really to this tragedy. He won a prize for the Junior Times in Los Angeles, and in 1926 he loved cartoons, which is why he ends up working in a cartoon-like way. But I want to show you how that developed. So even as a child, he was making cartoons, and this one won a prize. The year before, 1926, he had another one published in the Los Angeles Times. It featured a black character named Snowball. And he kept active in the newspaper's Junior Times Club, which was a way they had of getting young readers, getting them early. And he would send in cartoons and answers to puzzles. So he was quite involved with that. And as a birthday present for his 13th birthday, his mother gave him a correspondence course in cartooning. But he didn't stick it out. He never sticks out education for one reason or another. He got bored being shown basic things like cross-hatching and things, and after 3 lessons, he just gave it up. Let me just... this is skipping on a bit, but I'll also tell you about his high school. He entered Manual Arts High School, and he met other people who became artists, and he contributed cartoons and caricatures to the school newspaper. So it's kind of really important to remember that all the way through his life, he's drawing caricatures and cartoons. And I'll show you one that he makes much later of one of the presidents. They had a very interesting head of the art department, Frederick Schwankowski, who was very interested in European art. And he introduced the kids to European painting, particularly to Picasso and Cubism. And he was also into literature and mystical writings. And he encouraged the students to read arts magazines. So he was a great cultural influence. This is why school's so important. And in 1928, Guston met and became friends with Jackson Pollock at Manual Arts. Jackson Pollock, by the way, was not Jewish. Some people thought he was, it was, but he wasn't. And he was a little bit older, about 1.5 years, I think, older than Philip Guston. In 1929, he skipped a grade, went to a senior year, and he starts to copy the work of Piero della Francesca, that is, and Uccello and Masaccio from the public library. That's another reason why libraries are so important. And this teacher took them all away for a week, and they went to hear a Krishnamurti lecture. So ideas, philosophy, art, culture, they're all starting to form in this boy's mind. So in 1930, he did this picture. Now, he's only 17. You can see it's pretty amazing. It's quite a precocious piece of work. You know, he really was a precocious talent. And you can also see the influences. I'm going to just tell you them because it's Zoom and I can't ask for questions easily. But you can see Picasso, I think, and also De Chirico. And I'll just show you that. By the way, this painting is huge. It's really big. It's astonishing to think a boy of 17 did it. Although it's derivative, it's pretty impressive. So you can see how the buildings and the atmosphere are very much De Chirico, the surrealist, who would always do these kind of lonely townscapes, really, townscapes. And also Picasso, who round about this time and earlier was making these very large figures. statuesque women with small heads, and you can see that influence there. So he's not yet become himself, but this is where he is becoming himself. And I think this drawing was done as a rough for a mural he did, because he made a mural of Klansmen in 1930 with his friend Reuben, the artist Reuben, and it was defamed by police who were really probably in league with the Ku Klux Klan. There was a group called the Red Squad, who were basically sympathetic to white supremacists, and they destroyed the mural. But I think this is what the mural contained, partly. Certainly, if it wasn't this, it was something very similar. So he's reflecting the zeitgeist of the time. This is politically aware. He's working on public art projects and murals. And there's the notorious hooded figure. And it's very curious because you can see, well, can you see here? This is a lynching, but obviously knowing what we know about his personal history, this is also a personal reference as well for Philip Guston. And there's this tree and there's the cross. And I just want to sort of make the point that in a lot of art, traditionally, the tree in the Garden of Eden and the cross of the crucifixion are made from the same tree. And you see that in paintings by Cranach and other people. And then we've got this very thick rope here, which is done in massive detail. It really looks three-dimensional. So in this picture, we've got the personal and the political. He witnessed Klan rallies when he was young, and strike breaking as a Jewish kid growing up in Los Angeles in the 1920s. And obviously there were more Klan bombings and murders in the 1960s. And then we have the reference to his father's suicide, which he did actually talk in detail about the rope being really thick as a horse saw, that rope that pulls a ship. So a lot of things there. And this is the sort of picture that made the museums so anxious about putting on the retrospective of his work. It was the Ku Klux Klan imagery. They were worried, the museums, in 2020. It was postponed because they thought it would be upsetting, or that the pictures would be misinterpreted. So you have to remember, in 2020, this was in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, the African American who was murdered by a white police officer. And the whole thing raises a lot of questions about what are museums for, who makes these decisions, were they patronizing the audience, and so on. And how do we show difficult pictures? And it also feeds into the debate, I think, about sculptures that we know some of them have been destroyed, defaced, or taken away. And it's all part of this argument. So I would like you to think about it. However, what I want to think about is also the influence for this. And some of you might have picked up on this, but to me, it says a lot about the work of Francisco Goya. And I've picked this one to show you because this is a picture of a condemned man wearing this special paper tunic that the condemned wore, and a corazzo or capirote, which was a tall hat. These tall hats that Philip Guston has, these hooded figures, it reminds me. And I'm particularly, in view of the fact I'm doing this talk for Jewish Renaissance, I'm showing you this particular drawing because it's one of the ones, one of these ink drawings that Goya made for his portfolio on the Inquisition. And they're all in the British Museum. This particular one, this guy is condemned for having Jewish ancestry. And there's a priest there on the picture on the right. And this one here, on the left, is the officer of the Inquisition. And you can see his pose, he's in anguish. And underneath, Goya has put for being Jewish. That was the only thing he did. That was wrong. Have the wrong ancestry. So I think another influence on Guston's work. Okay, so he worked with Reuben Kaddish, making murals. And this is a lost segment. And he never attended art school, but he had all these art influences, and he also had a lot of literary influences. Isaac Babel was a favourite author, and several contemporary artists and writers became his friends, in particular Philip Roth, actually. He became friends early on, as I said, with Jackson Pollock, and later Mark Rothko and Willem de Kooning. So all through the 30s, he was working on murals and public art projects. And that was because he was absolutely fantastically elegant and able painter. Now, at the time as well, in 1936, there were a lot of murals being made because there was a lot of investment by President Roosevelt. In 1936, Roosevelt set up something called the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. It was an investment in public art, and Jackson Pollock also worked on murals, and it was the Federal Arts Project, also known as the FDA. So a really important time for painters. A lot of these murals, for whatever reason, have been destroyed, partly because they were made in a lot of public buildings which aren't around anymore as well. And at the same time, he was making beautiful portraits. And I particularly want to show you these. I've already showed you the picture of, oh, sorry. Oh, dear. I've already shown you the picture of his wife, and I wanted to show you this one because it was a black friend of his, just to show that these portraits were sympathetic and also very aesthetically pleasing. And this is a particular favourite of mine, actually. So all through the 40s, he's painting like this. They're figurative, they're very beautiful to look at, and they tell you a lot about, well, it's already a junkyard. Remember that his father was working as a junk man, and he put all this junk in his pictures. And this is how kids were playing. Poor kids would play on the streets. And this is just kind of post-war. And they're quite complex compositions. And they feature children. So this is, I mean, his own child was born, his own daughter was born in 1943. And they were about the upheaval and poverty of the war years and just after. And they reflect the figurative art of the period. There's people working a bit like this at the time. But again, if you look, he's got the hats. But as he was working, what he began to feel was more and more what he enjoyed was not painting the figures, but the bits in between, these bits in the corners here, these abstracted shapes, more and more. And they are still figurative, but only just. And he's interested in this kind of area at the bottom. And it becomes something like this, an abstract, lots of abstract shapes, but not quite abstract. But from now on, begin his years of abstraction, more and more. But gradually, he can't quite avoid the figurative. Gradually, shapes come up. Now, I find this very interesting because from somebody who could work so elegantly and so pleasingly, he starts, it's a very brave move, not just into abstraction, but into things which people won't necessarily like. And as he moves away from abstraction in the late 60s, he alienates a lot of people. So after more than a decade of abstract painting, he starts painting these sort of dark, blocky shapes in fields of grey. And they look, as it gradually gets called, a head. They look like a head. And whose head? Well, it's probably his head. Everything is his head. But he's sort of every man. Now, he was a part of a coterie of American abstract expressionists, and the group included Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko. I've mentioned them. In the late 60s and early 70s, when Philip Guston moved away from abstraction and into figurative painting, his former friends were outraged and they stopped speaking to him. His friend, the composer Morton Feldman, also cut him off. Only the painter Wilhelm de Kooning was sympathetic. Yet, in 1980, when Guston died, Morton Feldman came to the studio in Woodstock to join Philip Roth in saying Kaddish for him. And actually, Philip Guston wanted that. He wanted Kaddish said for him. So we have all these sort of objects that start appearing. And he left New York for a while, especially because his friends weren't talking to him, and he went to Florida. And these drawings became more and more minimal and more about the everyday. He and Philip Roth used to talk about the crapola of everyday life, you know, the crap, the everyday crap. And I do think it refers very much to, again, his father's experience of being a junk man. So let's have a look at some of these things that he is. Let's go back. Look at the things that he's doing. The light bulb. I told you about him working in the cupboard with the light bulb. Easel painting, which he is now doing after murals. Shoes, very much referring to his brother again, and his, well, this looks like one shoe, doesn't it? And here there's clouds of smoke. So make of that what you will, but I will say that he was a complete smoking addict, totally addicted to tobacco. In fact, even when he was dying, he had to have cigarettes. Which we'll see more of that. But also smoke could also refer to something else when you think about the Holocaust background of his family. So we have these books that come out more and more at the end of the 1960s, when Guston returned to figurative representation and when he was shunned. That must have been really hard for him. And, you know, they all used to meet in the same bars and they all thought they were really anti-establishment. So when he starts drawing things again, they thought that he was selling out. And pop art was one of the many modes becoming fashionable at the time. And they thought he was going commercial and trying to be a pop artist, which actually he wasn't. This was just it was an extension of his own personal history and of the cartoons that he's always made. But he had sort of terrible criticism from it, not just from his so-called friends, but also from the New York Times, for instance. The art critic Hilton Kramer, he wrote a vitriolic piece about Philip Guston's new work. He ridiculed Guston's new style in an article entitled "A Mandarin Pretending to be a Stumble Bum." I suppose, pretending to be a klutz when he was really an elegant painter and a high artist. But, Kramer didn't realise that Philip Guston was basically doing what he'd always done, cartoons, and it was his own thing, and he was actually being more of himself and not trying to be commercial. He eschewed concerns for convention, style and aesthetics, just to pursue his own truth. So a recurring motif is the book, forced into solidity with these thick, simplified outlines drawn with a brush. Coerced into a heavy object, the tome becomes a miniature skyscraper, a stone edifice with rectangular, dark, dotted windows, its edges slightly curved. And this one's called In the Beginning. It's an ossified manuscript, an ancient stone tablet like those carried by Moses and inscribed with the Ten Commandments. And the title of this drawing is also a biblical reference, In the Beginning. Maybe it also refers to Guston returning to his roots, his Jewish roots and his family origins, and to the essence of his own artwork. So this is 68, and as we know, 68 was the time of political unrest. So when this happened, this recalled Philip Guston's earlier memories of the Ku Klux Klan and his thoughts about the Holocaust. He watched this stuff on TV and he thought, what kind of a man am I, sitting at home, reading magazines, going into frustrated fury about everything, and then going into my studio to adjust a red to a blue. So this is the National Guardsman coming out to protect party delegates. I want you to notice this guy here, just in front of the hog butcher to the world. This guy with glasses. I don't know if anybody recognizes him. The guy with glasses doing the peace sign. For a week at the end of August 1968, city filled with party delegates and thousands of protesters. This guy in the white shirt and tie doing the peace sign beneath the word world, you might recognize it's Allen Ginsberg. Chicago's mayor, Richard Daley, was determined that the protesters wouldn't interrupt the convention, and he had the center surrounded with barbed wire and ordered the Illinois National Guard and the Chicago police to crush the demonstrators, even though they were completely peaceful. And as you can see, that is the peace sign. And there, inside, within the convention, there was a Jewish senator called Abraham Ripikoff, and he referred to Daley's actions as Gestapo tactics. Mayor Daley attacked Ripikoff, shouting, "Fuck you, you Jew son of a bitch, you lousy motherfucker, go home," unquote. Philip Guston, who was following this on the news in the papers, well, it just took him back 35 years to when, as a left-wing young Jew from an immigrant family, he had experienced the Klan inside the States and witnessed the rise of fascism outside of it. So this is the background to these hooded figures, but who is inside that mask? And appalled by the violence of Daley's forces and concerned by the brutality in the world around him, Philip Guston now creates paintings populated by imaginary Klansmen. This time he painted them like idiotic cartoon characters. And here he is in the studio, actually. It is himself. It is the painter. It doesn't say it's him, but it clearly is him. And there he is smoking endlessly. There's the puff of smoke again. And there's, it's like a mirror inside a mirror. There's himself painting himself, looking like the picture. And there's this weird thing, because there he is, a Jewish painter. He's painted himself as a Klansman. And he says, these are self-portraits. I perceive myself as being behind the hood. The idea of evil fascinated me. And rather like Isaac Babel, who had joined the Cossacks, lived with them and written stories about them, I almost tried to imagine that I was living with the clan. What would it be like to be evil, to plan and to plot? Or indeed, to even ride around with them. We've got the cigarette, the smoke again. So perhaps Guston is in this car too, driving around with the Klansman, always with the cigarette. Now the hooded figures draw less attention to external society, but more to the capacity for evil that lies within all of us. When Guston paints the self-portrait of the artist wearing a KKK hood, he's questioning his own psyche. And what do you think that red blob is in the foreground of the picture? The dire seriousness of the subject matter is offset by humour. It's not just the cartoon styles. Guston's heavy use of deep red was not, he explained, to symbolise blood, but simply inspired by his love of pastrami. Guston had a great facility. He could make beautiful art that was attractive and could sell, but he chose to ditch that and push himself to try something totally different. In that way, he was like his friend de Kooning, who also could draw beautifully, but was prepared to give it up when he could have been more commercially successful. They didn't want their work to be formulaic. And so this was an important moment of change in his work. Remember that all the way during the 50s and 60s, Guston was making cartoons, especially in letters to friends, even at the height of his abstraction fame. So this was always a part of himself. He just focused on it completely, and so in a way, just became himself. And the cartoonish nature of the later pictures reflect his boyhood fascination with comics and his continued love of caricature. From Crazy Cat to the Ku Klux Klan, 20th century America is encapsulated in Guston's works. And by the way, just to say also, those early comics that he was so influenced by, those artists were really good artists. They were fantastic draftsmen. Okay, 1971. Well, Nixon was elected president in November 1968, and I'm sure a lot of us here can actually remember that. And in 1971, Guston and his wife Musa were living in Woodstock. And Philip Roth lived nearby, and Philip Guston and Philip Roth were great friends. Roth was 20 years younger than Philip Guston, but they were still very good friends. And Philip Roth in 1971 was just finishing Our Gang, his novel of the Richard Nixon administration. So Guston was inspired by the manuscript, and he produced all these caricatures of Nixon, Spiro Agnew, and Henry Kissinger. And they went into a projected book called Poor Richard. Yeah, and I think it's just trying to kind of show Richard Nixon as being absurd. The two men were the same age, they're born in the same year, and this was about tracing Richard Nixon's life and remembering him as a red-baiting senator and a hypocrite. So here's another picture, which seems to be another self-portrait. And really, he didn't look after himself. He ate loads of junk food, he smoked all the time, and this is pretty much his life, painting, smoking and eating. 71, he moves back into painting, and for the next 3 years, he gradually let go of the hoods and developed a new alter ego, this kind of cyclops with a bulbous head. The late works bear witness to his lifestyle, the ill health and troubled past. And in this one, it's just the bloated figure lying smoking in bed, huge chin, huge eye in profile, a plate of congealed chips on his chest. But we can see other motifs as well. There's what looks like a light bulb and a rope, but it could be a noose, and this one could be the rope to the light bulb. They're sort of a bit interchangeable. And he keeps including these stark light bulbs, just like the one that he had when he was painting in the cupboard as a child. And then we've got a pile of shoes. And if you've been to any of the Holocaust museums, like the Imperial War Museum in London, where they have a display like that in the Holocaust exhibition, that's what it reminds me of. But of course, it also references his poor brother. Pit, again, we're reminded of the Holocaust in the depiction of the pile of shoes, and it's a fire pit. Those are the flames. So it could be very much a motif for the Holocaust. And this one, just the image of fire, just called flame. And this one too, a single hat on a brick wall, where the thin horizontal white lines dissect the canvas above like barbed wire. Philip Guston was adamant that an artist's responsibility was to so-called unnumb themselves. That's his own word. His responsibility was the artist's responsibility was to unnumb themselves and bear witness to atrocity. Half a century later, the challenge remains and is perhaps more necessary than ever. Guston's homage to Michelangelo depicts the creator as an artist, or is it the artist as creator? The unnumb hand is not up in the clouds, but down to earth, recording the reality of life. No longer just choosing whether to make a red or a blue, he's making statements about what's going on around him. This is the last image, the couple in bed. I think it's just a really touching portrait of the artist and his wife. He lies in the fetal position, knees drawn up, one hand clutching brushes, and the woman who held him together. It's one of the most revealing pictures. So I'm going to end on that one because it's getting near to bedtime for us. Yeah, that's the final one. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and come back to you. And that's it.
But what an amazing amount you covered in 45 minutes.
Tried.
A real kind of exploration of his life and his work. And it's so interesting because you're always giving us that both and. Like on the one hand, his use of cadmium red. He jokes about his love of pastrami. But I think you were very clearly showing us that it really was blood too. Or, the hat on the wall is a hat on a wall, but a hat on a wall under barbed wire is also very reminiscent of the gates of Auschwitz.
Yeah. Yes, and I think in a way he's putting all those emotions and all those memories into his paintings, but he's less inclined to talk about them in words. So I think that's a little bit, that Jewish thing of using that flippant humor, which is so common, isn't it? So we say, oh no, it's just pastrami, but but is it?
Absolutely. I mean, how was it taken at the time? We know that obviously in post Black Lives Matter, there was a lot of fear around these Ku Klux Klan portraits because the curators had a fear that people wouldn't be able to understand that it was a comment on the negativity of the Klan rather than a kind of praise of them. What was the response of the world at the time to him doing these cartoons?
I don't think there was so much problem. I think there was much less awareness. Remember what happened later is it was the worry by the people running the museums
Mm,
and with George Floyd, and it's become so much a political um I was going to say football, cannonball, explosion, really. But
mm,
at the time, it wasn't really considered. So I mean, who knows actually who was really seeing them, and was it the black community looking at them? Private collectors have been keen on collecting them, and his daughter has given a lot of donations to museums, which is also a way of keeping it going. And they're now selling for a fortune. I mean, one of them sold for, millions, absolute millions. And
mm,
I'm not sure, I don't think it was a Klansman, but another one. So he has become incredibly popular. He's always been an artist. I was introduced to his work actually in the 80s by somebody who bought one of my pictures, and I hadn't heard of him then. And that's when I first started looking. And about 20 years ago, the Royal Academy did a show of his.
mm,
So, that, but I always really love, I mean, I really love the aesthetic works. The others are hard to stomach,
mm,
but there's that duality, because I also think that art isn't just about having a pleasing picture on the wall. It's also about making a statement. So I think they're brave, actually.
yeah. Did any, because you talk about his friends, so he went through these three periods, right? He went
Yes.
through the kinds of beautiful Zico influenced, wonderful aesthetic paintings. Then he went through the kind of purely abstract, kind of very kind of influenced by Rothko and Pollock. And then he moves back to the figurative, but to this cartoon-like figuration. Those artists who were his colleagues in abstraction who rejected him when he returned to the figurative. Did they ever change their minds about him? Or do you think the world, now that they understand about his political drive, has changed any opinion of him, and which period of his work is the most influential?
I mean, that's a very good question. I think the abstract ones have been rather lost because they're not so much his. I mean, the first two periods are both very elegant, whether he's working figuratively or in abstraction.
Mm,
They are elegant, they're beautifully done. And actually, even the cartoon ones, he can handle paint brilliantly. He just can't help that. But he's trying not to do it. That's why it's so brave.
mm,
But his friends, I mean, the only person who stayed friends with him was William de Kooning, who was, also said, yeah, it's really important to be yourself and to experiment. But the
mm,
others didn't. But then, they didn't change, and they didn't want to change.
mm,
And they saw themselves as being against everybody else. And of
mm,
course, Rothko died young anyway.
mm,
So,
mm.
yeah.
Very, my last question, and then I'm hoping there are some questions from the floor. I can see Babette has her hand up. And please, if you do have a question, just put a note in the chat and we'll bring you on screen. But I'm going to ask one last question before I bring Babette in, which is about the literary influences.
Yeah.
Um, you talked about Isaac Barber and his Red Cavalry and this idea of you understand someone by riding
With the
with
cavalry.
evil. Yeah. You understand evil by trying to experience what other people are like. And
Mm.
then you showed us the political images which had Allen Ginsberg in them, and obviously his kind of howl is his
Yeah,
big political
yeah.
poem, his big cry out. Um, and yet kind of I wondered if, so we can see very you know, very obviously the Red Cavalry influences. Do you feel like any of the Howl or those modernist poets came into his work later? Was it just Philip Roth? Were there other literary influences?
Yes, there were, and actually not just the modern poets. There was also Yeats. He was very well read.
Mm.
Um, a lot of different poets. I can't remember who else, but Yeats in particular, which you can imagine, can't you?
Things fall apart.
Things fall apart. It's the centre will not hold. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. I'm
Okay.
going to be quiet now for a while because I think there are other people who want to speak to you. So let me bring Babette on first of all.
Okay.
Thank
Hi,
you.
Babette.
Hi, thanks, Irene. It was wonderful, like always. No, I was wondering, I don't know many of his works, although several of those you showed I had seen. Um, Painting his past, always bringing things in from terrible experiences and family experiences. Um, I didn't see any pictures of his wife, his mother, his daughter, his family, his brother. Are there any?
Thank you. I'm very glad you brought that up, Babette, because I was going to sort of fit it in somewhere, and I thought, well, I might mention it later, and then I forgot. And trust you to bring it up as a woman. Thank you. Quite right. His wife was a fantastic artist. She was a mural artist herself. Beautiful work. She gave it all up. She did become a poet and published poet. She gave it all up just to support him in his endeavors as an artist. It was the typical thing, you know, one household, two people. It's going to be the man who's going to be the artist and the woman who is there behind him. I think he must have been a complete nightmare to live with. He he painted all day and most nights, I think. He had a studio across the road. His daughter, who has made it her job to, she's an educationalist, I think, perhaps a psychotherapist as well, understandably, to promote his work. But she never got enough of him. I mean, I think she basically got enough of him through creating his work. That was another way of being close to him. Because
Linda's just put in the chat. Could you remind us what his wife's name was?
yes, Linda, I was hoping you wouldn't say that because my mind's gone blank. It's Musa McKim.
That's right.
Yeah, Musa McKim. But exactly, and I deliberately fudged that because I couldn't remember for a moment. And his daughter, who was called Agna, was also called Musa, as also known as that. So I think, and also he had lots of affairs. At one point, he left his wife for about 6 months, went off to live with a much younger woman, which of course, you know, was went terribly wrong. And then he begged his wife to take him back. He adored his wife, but he was just one of these men. And actually, I think all those abstract expressionists were like that. I mean, I think, you know, like Philip Roth as well, you know, he's one of these American men, great at what they did, and actually expected everybody else to think so too, and that nothing else was as important as their art, you know, whether it was writing or poetry or painting in his case. So for a very good reason. I mean, early on he did that portrait. Yes, poor woman sat for him for that. But later on, it's not about that. Except that, like that picture of the couple, that is her. And that is very tender. And, you know, relationships are complicated. And I think his were just more complicated than many. Yeah.
Not his father, not his mother.
Well, what about his mother? Paintings of his mother.
Did he paint his parents at all?
Well, his father died when he was so young. And his mother, I don't know. I haven't seen any pictures of his mother by him. I mean, when he was a kid, he was still painting cartoons. And then when he became educated, he was copying the masters. So, but it's a very good point, actually. And it does indicate as well where his allegiance lies.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Does anyone else have any questions they would like to ask? I asked for questions in the chat, and instead I've got lots of people writing saying, thank you for an excellent talk.
Oh,
But no
thank you.
actual questions. We have one. We've got one from Tony.
Tony, I hope I can answer it.
So Tony, let me bring you on screen, Tony, and then ask you to unmute and ask it yourself.
Hiya.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Well, I love the talk. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Could I start by saying I'm too modest to point out I recognised Allen Ginsberg. But anyway, enough.
Oh, great. No, I'm glad you did. It was one of those things I couldn't ask people as I was showing it because it's Zoom, but still, yeah. Lovely. Glad you recognised.
Do you think, looking at the paintings, that we can, to what extent can we fully appreciate them on their own, out of context? Like take those, like me looking at in red, the book with the little stripes, columns on it, you know, to represent print and all that. Do you think it's enough to only see that painting, or you really need to see the other paintings to realize that they're part of a series, or you really need to know more about his life and who he, you know, his fellow artists in order to fully appreciate it? Do you see what I mean?
I do. I see completely. And I think it's a really good question. I mean, if you only saw that picture of the book, which looks so kind of rough, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You'd think, is this great art? Do we need to know it's a great artist? I think it's a really, really good question. I don't know, because it's impossible to unknow that he did them. So I don't know quite how I'd feel otherwise. And I've seen his work in a progression. I mean, what I do know, is that unlike a lot of people who do very sort of work which might look facile, they don't necessarily have his skill and ability, that amazing facility he had with painting. I mean, the murals he did, even as a young man, they are astonishing. I mean, they're sort of, you know, like Renaissance things, really. And so, having known that, I think, wow, this is a really brave move to be. I don't think I would want to give up showing off that skill, but he was prepared just to divorce it and do what seemed right. So that's what I admire. And I mean, my favorite paintings of his, I mean, I find everything interesting, but my favorite paintings of his are actually those compositions he did in the 1940s of the children playing in the junkyards. I love those paintings.
They're quite complicated, aren't they?
They are complicated, and I spent ages when I first saw it years and years ago in real life. I spent ages looking at it, thinking, wow, I wish I could paint like that. So I always think like that about his pictures. But as to understanding what everything meant, I don't know. Out of context, I don't know. I mean, you'd look at it and you think, just like I did when I looked at it, is this a book or is it a building?
Okay.
You know, and what does it mean? But I am used to kind of looking at pictures and thinking, what's this trying to say? So I think they give us a lot of food for thought, even if they don't necessarily satisfy us aesthetically in that way. Yeah. Good question.
I don't want to take up time, so do cut me off. But did they remind you at all of Charlotte Solomon? That kind of commentary on her, what was going through her head? No.
It's funny you should say that, because I did think of something being a bit like Charlotte Solomon, in as much as she was whipping out loads and loads and loads of drawings very quickly, and they had to be done quickly, and often they were done with a brush.
Okay.
So from that point of view, yes, but otherwise, no. Yeah, but thank you, because it did actually make me think about at one point. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. But thanks very much. It was lovely.
Thanks, Tony. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tony. And we've got so many comments just in the chat saying thank you. Jenny, Linda, Anna, people saying, some of them who've seen the exhibition and are saying thank you for elucidating it, and others saying, well, Jenny particularly was saying she's going next week.
Oh, great.
Thank you, because you've given her the context through which she can view it. But I want to add that thanks, because it is perfect timing. It's dead on 8:30. Judy Herman has just put in the chat, and I think the chat just comes to me rather than general. So I'm just going to read out as my thank you what Judy Herman's written in the chat, because it's so beautifully spoken. She said it was a riveting lecture and beautiful, revealing, sometimes melancholy, sometimes humorous. Sometimes, and I think she's talking about Philip Guston there and about you as well. She said, and sometimes both. You know, you can have both in one painting, and thank you so much.
Thank you. You can tell Judy I just read her review, and I thought of and I thought it was beautifully written. Actually, you can tell her that.
That was the review of the goods trade, the
Exactly.
Spyro.
Yeah, I thought that was a lovely read, actually. So
oh, lovely.
Thank you very much. I hope I have inspired people to go and see the exhibition. It's on for about 3 more weeks, I think.
Yeah,
so,
Yeah,
absolutely have.
Thanks,
In a moment, I will let you all unmute so you can verbally thank Irene yourselves if anyone wants to speak to her before we log off. But I just want to say to you all, if you've enjoyed tonight, there are a few things coming up that might also interest you. So in 3 weeks' time, we have our big launch of our current issue, our winter issue, which is focused on the future of Israel's kibbutzim. So in our magazine, there is a very in-depth piece as well as a photo essay. I'm not sure how many people know, but Kibbutz Be'eri in particular hosted a fabulous gallery for contemporary art. And several of those kibbutzim in the south of Israel that were attacked on 7th of October were hotbeds of culture, particularly of art and also photography. And the kibbutz movement as a whole was is still, but within those kibbutz in particular, was a central plank of Israeli national identity, the center of culture, a center of the peace movement. So we are going to look at the kibbutz movement. We're going to celebrate those kibbutzim as they were, and also ask what they can become again. We're going to look at some of the images that were taken from the galleries, some of the images that were taken on October the 7th. And among others, I mean, we have a fantastic group of speakers. We have David Leach, who is the author of a book called The Future of the Kibbutz in Divided Israel. We've got Sophie Mackey, who is the curator, visual artist, who is the director of the Be'eri Gallery, and looking at how it might be possible to revive it. We've got Ranen Omer Sherman, who's Chair of Judaic Studies at the University of Louisville, who is writing a lot of kind of the kibbutz in literature and film. And particularly we have Julia Chatain, who is a resident of Kibbutz Urim and a psychologist and a big peace activist. So we hope you'll all come and join us for that. And then later on in March, we are kicking off a weekly series, which was called The Yiddishists, and is going to look at everything from Isaac Bashevis's sister, Esther Kreitman, who lived in Stoke Newington and was an amazing writer in her own right, to Freud. Many of you might not know, but Freud appeared regularly in the Yiddish press and had a big Yiddish following. So we're going to look at a little bit like that. We've got the Yiddish Book Centre in Massachusetts, who are putting on a special programme for us. And we've got Michael Rosen and Sophie Herxheimer, who are going to look at how they use Yiddish in their poetry.
Oh, lovely.
So really lovely series, and I hope you'll join us for some of those sessions. But meanwhile, I want to say again, massive thank you to Irene, and we'll bring you all up now if anyone wants to unmute yourselves and give her a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks for sticking it out. Thank you.
Tremendous.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, both of you. Thank you.
Really appreciated.
Thank you.